First, want to thank everyone, especially our witness, for joining us for our hearing today. After recognizing myself and the ranking member, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes, each for opening statements, I will recognize the members of the subcommittee for 2 minutes each for their opening statements. We will then proceed directly to hear testimony from our distinguished witness. The full text of the written testimony will be inserted into the record. Without objections, members may have 5 days to submit statements and questions for the record. After we hear from our witness, individual members will be recognized for 5 minutes, each for questions to our witness. And I now recognize myself for an opening statement. It's a new year with a new budget hearing, and things look worse for the United States today than they did last year. We spent approximately $1.8 billion on programs in the Western Hemisphere last year, and we find that the region has less economic freedom, an increased homicide rate, and reduced press freedom. If it was a private company generating this data instead of the U.S. government, it would be made clear that the product is failing to provide desired results, and the contract would not be extended. Unfortunately, these figures represent the outcome of the U.S. government's programs, and this backsliding is compounded by an increased lack of respect for the United States. The headlines emanating from the Summit of the Americas widely reported that the United States is isolated within the region. We have been in a senior position on issues relating to the in a senior position on issues relating to the hemisphere for over 10 years. During this time, we have not held the Organization of American States accountable for their inability or lack of desire to act on behalf of democracy in the hemisphere. Now we see the discussion of redefining democracy gaining steam in the region. While it may be a complex system of governing and is difficult to attain and maintain, democracy has but one definition: government by the people. It is clear that Cuba does not have government by the people. Other nations in the region have mutilated government by the people by utilizing executive power to alter constitutions and by daily assaults on free speech. Democratic principles act as a standard for protecting freedom. If these principles slip within our region, the impact to security and the economy will be lasting. Over the past 10 years, U.S. assistance supporting democratic efforts has been cut, while the OAS has received yearly increases. Nicaragua and Ecuador have worked counter to freedom and received a boost in U.S. funding, and new global climate change programs have maintained a healthy stipend. Meanwhile, our allies were dragged through a negative campaign on the free trade agreements and frustrated on the Keystone XL pipeline. Are we to understand that $78 million spent on climate change programs outside of our country took priority over enhancing business partnerships and the principles of freedom for the citizens of our region? Backsliding in the hemisphere is extensive, with attacks on the press and business from Argentina to Ecuador, Ortega's stealing the election in Nicaragua, Chavez's involvement in all of the above while ceding Venezuela to drug traffickers and terrorists. Billions of dollars are going to fight the drug trade with countries who take a public stand against U.S. policies, all while the region bands together to demand the world's longest dictatorship in Cuba a seat at the Democratic Gathering of Nations. Assistant Secretary, I look forward to hearing how you will improve the markers on this declining state in which we find ourselves. As I have said, and I'm sure you agree, the strengthening of our economy and the durability of our national security starts right here, with the powerful economies in our region and at our borders. Unfortunately, our policies have come down to promoting the lowest common denominator in an attempt to maintain friends. In the end, we have lost our friends and our values. I hope that you will explain how you will use your new position and a requested $1.5 billion to set the United States on a more prosperous path forward, standing with our allies and putting our principles before our adversaries. With that, I now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Engel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding this hearing today with the Summit of the Americas having taken place in Cartagena, Colombia just a week and a half ago. This hearing is a timely review of U.S. policies and priorities in Latin America and the Caribbean. Before discussing our region, I would like to extend my warmest congratulations to Assistant Secretary Roberta Jacobson, whose nomination was recently approved by the Senate. Roberta, your work is widely respected, and your abilities are highly regarded by me and by many, many others. I could not be happier for you, for the Department, for our country, and I wish you the best of luck, and I'm anxious to hear what you'll be testifying about today. I must say, however, that your nomination was yet another example of how the nominations process in the Senate is failing. When individual senators can hold up qualified, non-political nominees like yourself due to one agenda or another, it just shows that the system is broken and the time to fix it is now. Mr. Chairman, so Mr. Mack, if you're in the other body, I'm going to count on you to fix the system. Mr. Chairman, you and I were with President Obama, as well as Secretary Jacobson at the Summit of the Americas. We had the opportunity to speak with leaders of the region about the conditions in their countries, how they see the region, their ties with the United States. We learned a great deal about how our friends to the south view key issues, including how to work together to halt the illicit drug trade and associated violence and expand trade and prosperity to all people in our hemisphere. Personally, I would like to express my deepest thanks to President Obama for including me in his delegation at the summit. It was eye-opening to watch the proceedings not from the angle of the legislative branch, but through the lens of the executive. And having been there, I must say that President Obama, Secretary Clinton, and the rest of the U.S. team performed very well and represented our country with distinction. I thank them for our efforts. Many good things happened at the Summit of the Americas, many good things that the United States is doing. You wouldn't necessarily know that from the media coverage, who's focusing on a scandal, but believe me, there were many, many important things at that summit, and I was proud to be a part of it. Secretary Jacobson, I know this subcommittee is looking forward to hearing from you on some of the key issues we are monitoring in our region. I think we need to continue to assist Haiti so it can rebuild from the earthquake. We'll listen carefully to your thoughts on how the drug crime is affecting our friends in Mexico, Central America, and the Caribbean, and how our counter-narcotics response is proceeding. We look forward to your comments on the more challenging countries in the hemisphere, including Venezuela, Ecuador, and others, and of course, Cuba. As Mr. Mack mentioned, many of the countries are demanding that the next time there's a summit that Cuba be a part of it. I question and say, well, what's Cuba's responsibility? Well, we wanted to invite them, but what are they willing to do in order to get invited? And so far, I don't think we've seen very much. And with the U.S.-Colombia FTA entering force next month, we're hoping you will discuss how this will expand prosperity in the region and create jobs in the U.S., but also your thoughts on the status of implementation of the Labor Action Plan. So, Mr. Chairman, I thank you again for holding this hearing, and I look forward to the testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Engel, and I'd now like to recognize Mr. Sears for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Chairman Mack. Congratulations on your confirmation. Congratulations on your appointment. You have an easy job. It's only about, I don't know how many countries we have, but I'll just share a couple of things of my concern. And first, I want to thank Chairman Mack for taking the trip down to the summit. It was very informative, and it was nice to see the Secretary there. But, you know, in meeting with the different presidents and the different dignitaries that we met with, I took one thing away, which is very important. And obviously is also our concern, is the drug problem. And one of the things that I took with me is the concern that we're not doing a regional effort to combat the cartels. I think that we put a lot of money in one country. I don't think we put enough on some of the other countries. And from what I gather is what happens when we fight in Mexico, or put some money in some of the other countries, the other countries become roots. And it's that old expression of the balloon. You squeeze it here, and something else pop up someplace else. So I've been saying this since I got to Congress, that our effort has to be a regional effort. This is not now that we're in the minority, but when we were in the majority, we always talked about a regional effort. And it was just confirmed in talking to some of the presidents at the summit. They're concerned that they're not getting enough assistance to help us fight the drug problem. The other thing that concerns me is that it seems that we are trending away from the Western Hemisphere and looking at South Central Asia and the Middle East. And some of the money seems to be going there. I think that there is no better opportunity for us than in the Western Hemisphere. And to take money away at this time, I don't think is really the best policy that this country can have. And with that, I'll end, and I'll let the Assistant Secretary make her comments, and I have some questions for the Assistant Secretary later. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. And now I'd like to recognize Mr. Rivera from Miami for 2 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, thank you for being here. Very nice to see you again after spending some time together in Cartagena. In terms of my opening statement, I just want to give you some of my reflections based on our trip to participate and observe the Summit of the Americas in Cartagena, Colombia. And one of the biggest concerns that I took away from that summit was this notion that I believe President Santos had introduced maybe weeks or months earlier when the issue of Cuba's integration into the summit process came up. President Santos talked about perhaps the need to redefine our definition of democracy, because as we know, one of the premises of the summit process is, of course, participation of democratic nations. And I think it's a very dangerous, slippery slope that we get into if presidents start talking about redefining democracy, because I think there are a lot of tyrants around the world, and certainly in Latin America, or prospective tyrants, that could seek refuge in the notion that we somehow need to redefine democracy just to make an accommodation or to apologize for a communist totalitarian dictatorship in Cuba. So I want to explore that a little more in my question and answer session, but I certainly want you to know that I hope this administration will summarily reject the notion that democracy needs to be redefined somehow in order so that we can accommodate tyrants like the Castro brothers, because all that will do is encourage further anti-democratic behavior in the hemisphere. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. I would now like to recognize our witness. And first of all, again, congratulations on your appointment and nomination. The Honorable Roberta Jacobson currently serves as the Assistant Secretary for the Western Hemisphere Affairs Bureau. She's had a long and distinguished career, and we mean that in a good way, with the State Department and on issues relating to the Western Hemisphere. You're certainly no stranger to the committee, to the Hemisphere, and we value your input and direction, and look forward to a spirited conversation about how we improve our relations in Latin America to do what I think most people desire, and that is see the cause of freedom and democracy extended to all. So with that, I recognize the Assistant Secretary for 5 minutes for her opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, very much. Chairman Mack, Ranking Member Engel, members of the committee, it's a privilege to be here today, and it's particularly nice to be back in this chamber after an absence of several months. And I really appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and the support and engagement that this subcommittee has given to our efforts in the Western Hemisphere. I also thank all of you for being in Cartagena, Colombia, and I look forward to talking about the Summit of the Americas with you. We are fortunate that in our hemisphere, we are overwhelmingly presented with opportunities to advance U.S. objectives and promote democracy and greater prosperity for the United States and all the countries of the region. As you noted, the President and the Secretary's engagements in Colombia demonstrated the power of this vision to expand social and economic opportunity, but the summit also provided an opportunity to continue our work standing up for shared democratic values in the Americas. We are especially engaged in responding to threats against democratic governance and freedom of expression, threats to citizen security, and threats from external actors in the Western Hemisphere that directly impact the security of the United States. The Summit of the Americas showcased the region's rapid change. Although obscured by reporting on other issues, the summit highlighted the many practical ways that governments and citizens in the Americas are coming together to solve problems and build a more successful and connected future. President Obama reinforced the spirit of partnership that has been at the core of his administration's policy in the region. The Colombian government's program for this year's summit, including the CEO Forum and civil society forums, was a successful example of what Secretary Clinton calls the three-legged stool of a democratic society: accountable governments, private sectors creating opportunities, and engaged civil societies. The initiatives that we launched at the summit included the establishment of the Small Business Network of the Americas to provide technical assistance to small and medium-sized enterprises and encourage American SMEs to take advantage of the market in this region, announcement of the Women's Entrepreneurship Network, advancement of the President's 100,000 Strong in the Americas effort to increase student exchanges, expansion of regional broadband capacity, and support for innovation efforts in development. I'm especially enthusiastic about the United States' role in the creation of Colombia's Connect 2022 initiative to expand electrical connectivity throughout the Americas. Through equal partnership and the power of proximity, the United States is working with capable regional partners to address key challenges facing the people of the Americas. Increasingly, these partnerships do not require U.S. assistance, as more and more countries become global players and donors in their own right. At the same time, transnational crime in the hemisphere has caused violence that makes day-to-day life for some of the region's people intolerable. Sustained U.S. engagement and assistance on this front is required to counter these threats, to improve the lives of people throughout the region and protect our security interests. The administration's FY13 request of $1.65 billion for the Western Hemisphere prioritizes our security initiatives in Mexico, in Colombia, in Central America, and in the Caribbean. Our requests for these initiatives reflect an emphasis on enhancing capacity and strengthening institutions over the long term. Our assistance draws on the capacity of partners in the hemisphere, such as Colombia and Mexico, and other international donors, such as Canada, the EU, Spain, the Inter-American Development Bank, and others. Our FY13 request also prioritizes assistance for Haiti to support the country's ongoing development efforts, focused on sanitation and health services, expansion of energy infrastructure, economic growth to increase job creation, and improving the government's ability to deliver needed services. In Mexico, we continue our shift away from heavy equipment and towards institutional capacity building. We're continuing to work with Colombia in its whole-of-government effort to expand state presence in former conflict zones and protect human rights and economic development. During the Summit of the Americas, the President also announced our intention to seek an increase to at least $130 million for our assistance under the Central American Citizen Security Partnership in response to continued high levels of violence in that region. Finally, let me mention that democracy assistance is also a critical component in achieving our goals, and our commitment to democracy and human rights throughout the hemisphere is unwavering. We will continue to support human rights activists and fundamental freedoms around the world, including in challenging environments like Nicaragua, Ecuador, Venezuela, and Cuba. Thank you again, Mr. Chairman, and I look forward to continuing to work with you to advance U.S. interests in the hemisphere.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your opening statement, and now recognize myself 5 minutes for questions. I want to explore a little bit more with you the idea that we seem to be cutting funds for supporting democratic efforts, but we see an increase in funds that goes to the OAS. Can you tell me why is it that it appears that, I'll just say it this way, it appears that we are making it more difficult for our allies, and that the enemies of the United States tend to be getting a pass. And we see it through the FTAs and how long it took and this drawn-out campaign on the FTAs. We see it now with the Keystone XL pipeline. That in foreign policy, if we want to say it matters to be a friend of the United States, but then when we have the ability for a Keystone pipeline or for the FTAs, we drag our allies through the mud. Can you kind of explain why it is that funding for democracies has gone down while increased funding to the OAS when the OAS has, I believe, failed in its mission? And then why do we tend to give a hard time to our allies instead of supporting them with free trade agreements and Keystone XL pipeline?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I want to start off by saying that we certainly are delighted that the free trade agreements are entering into force, that we were able to move those ahead, and that they are strong free trade agreements that will serve both countries, in each case the bilateral agreements, very well. We now have free trade agreements that run from Canada all the way down through South America in many countries of the hemisphere, and that remains a very important part of our policy.
But you won't, you'll admit that it was a very long time, and you've got to admit that the length of time it took to get them done in relation to how long it takes free trade agreements to get done in other places with Latin America countries and other countries has made it difficult for us in the hemisphere.
It did take a long time, there's no doubt, but in the end what we achieved in terms of agreements with all of these countries, I think, were stronger agreements. The Labor Action Plan and the implementation of that action plan is making a difference on the ground, and we're delighted that this is going to open up such new opportunities for American jobs and for the economies in the region. But when it comes to supporting democracies and supporting our allies, let me start with, for example, the Citizen Security Initiatives, which, while Mexico and Colombia are going down, because those are countries that are capable of taking over those programs, certainly as many years after we began Plan Colombia as we now are. But in places like Central America, the funding is going up because we know that our allies in Central America who are fighting this shared responsibility with us need more help to confront this problem. But I also want to mention that in the OAS, there are some critically important efforts that the OAS has undertaken on democracy issues where we think we have to continue to support them, including financially. That includes election observation and monitoring and reports that have come out in very challenging environments such as Nicaragua. It includes the Special Rapporteur for Press Freedom, an issue that I know many on this committee are concerned about, and an issue that's been under some pressure in the OAS, where we think it's important that we continue to fund those efforts.
Thank you for your answer. I don't know that I completely agree. I mean, if you just look at this graph, it shows that the freedom of the press in Latin America has been on a steady decline. So I don't know that, again, this is one of the things I pointed to in my opening statements. I don't know that that this is a show of success for what's happening, and I think the OAS stands in the way of democracy, and that we ought to be strengthening our relationships with our friends and allies instead of turning it over to the OAS. And I know you'll disagree, and I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to talk about that. I want to hit on the idea of, about Cuba for a moment, because it was disturbing at the summit to hear the different countries, so many of them, talk about wanting Cuba to be part of the next summit or be included in the OAS when Cuba's not a democracy. And the idea that we're going to allow a a dictatorship to be part of a organization that is to promote democracy, and even to go so far as to talk about redefining democracy, almost like trying to create a special space for Cuba that shouldn't exist. I mean, this is a country, and I think we would agree with this, you would agree with me on this, that all the tools, everything that needs to happen with Cuba is in their hands, with free and fair elections, releasing the political prisoners, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, becoming a democracy. They would be welcomed. But I'm concerned about the overall take in the Western Hemisphere that we're losing ground with even with our allies on this issue, and I'd just like to get your response to that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think the President and the Secretary have addressed this issue very well. We certainly agree with you that democracy is not a relative concept. It's a universal concept, and it's enshrined in documents in this hemisphere, in the Inter-American Democratic Charter and in the summit process from 2001, when democratic governance was required of those participating in summits. And so we too look forward to the day when Cuba can participate in the summits, but that day has not come yet. So we feel very strongly about that is a requirement to participate.
And you would also say it hasn't come yet because it's
right.
Cuba's responsibility, not the responsibility of the United States or any other country in the hemisphere to turn the blind eye to what they're doing.
Absolutely, absolutely. The roadmap has been set out for Cuba to take that path and enter back into the inter-American system.
Thank you. I'd now like to recognize Congressman Engel for the ranking member for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. You and I agree on much of what needs to be done vis-a-vis the United States and in Latin America policy. But I do agree with you that one of the reasons I supported the free trade agreements with both Panama and Colombia was that I think it is important that we let our friends know that there is an upside into being allies with the United States. I think that there's a geopolitical reason for us to do these things, and I think that's very important. And I do agree with the chairman that we have to show countries that it's good to align with us, not with the Chavezes of the world, because we are reliable. So we share that. I do, however, think that the President did a very good job, and the administration did a very good job in shepherding the free trade agreements. It's very difficult, very politically tricky, and the President did it, and it's done, and I commend the administration for doing it, and I think we're going to see more things like that. I also agree with the chairman that the OAS is a far from perfect organization, but I think where we disagree is I believe it's the best we have. If we don't strengthen the OAS, and if we start pulling back so that the United States does not have as much influence as it does on the OAS, we are going to find that the alternatives are far worse. For instance, I want to ask the Secretary, how does she view the CELAC? Is it a competitor to the OAS? Shouldn't we be concerned? I believe we should, that the U.S. is not a member, but many of the countries antagonistic to the United States in the hemisphere, including Cuba, are. So it's almost like be careful what you wish for, because if there are these other organizations that do not allow the U.S. or Canada to participate, I think we're better off staying with the OAS, strengthening the OAS, not pulling funds away from the OAS, and going with the organization where we have influence and where we can help to shape things the way we see it. And I do agree with both you and the chairman that, and I said it in my opening remarks, that Cuba needs to do a lot more before it can be admitted to the OAS or Summit of the Americas. And I almost find it preposterous that they refuse to do more They still have Alan Gross, an American citizen, and yet they think that they can just become members of all these organizations without making a change. So I'm wondering if you could talk to me about CELAC and the OAS and these other things that I mentioned.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I think we agree on a lot of these issues. Multilateral diplomacy has been a big part of this administration's push. We think that when we act with other countries in the hemisphere, we get better results. We have a stronger position. The best forum for doing that, we believe, is the OAS. It's the longest standing body in the hemisphere. It's got institutions that have been developed to carry out some of its functions, technical functions, whether that's election monitoring or the special rapporteurs on various issues that I think are very important at giving voice to some of these democracy issues and others. CELAC, honestly, is very new. It is hard to say where it's going and what it will be like. Obviously, there are lots of different regional organizations, some of which do not include us and have existed on and off over the past number of years. So I think it's a little bit early for us to say whether CELAC really becomes a competitor to the OAS. Our goal is to support the OAS and to continue to view the OAS, which someday will have, I think, a democratic Cuba as a member, and thereby include all of the countries of the hemisphere as the primary multilateral vehicle in the hemisphere.
Thank you. Can you talk a little bit about the Summit of the Americas? We all went, all of us up here, all four of us up here. And if you listen to the media, you hear about the scandal with the Secret Service, but you don't hear about the good work that was done. What's your assessment of the work that was done at the summit?
Thank you. I guess I would start out by saying that the sheer fact, and many of you spoke about this, the President spoke about this, the sheer fact that we were in Cartagena, Colombia, safely for a number of days in a hemispheric gathering was pretty remarkable after the decade plus that Colombia has been through. And I think in some ways, Colombia's leadership of this summit demonstrated just how far they've come and the kind of partnerships we really do want to create throughout the hemisphere. And so I think Colombia, as the host and leader of this summit, was very significant. Similarly, I think the way they structured this, and I made reference to this in my statement, the way they structured this summit was a very important model. By having a CEO summit where the private sector really, for the first time, was able to have a true dialogue with the leaders, and a civil society summit, they set up a model which really can serve us well in the future. These summits can't be government leaders isolated from those two other constituencies in the hemisphere. But lastly, I would note that although there was a lot of commentary on the lack of a political declaration signed by all the leaders at the end of the summit, it isn't the first time that that's occurred. And unfortunately, we didn't have consensus on every issue. One of these, as you know, was Cuba. There were others. But what's, I think, missing from a lot of the commentary is there was huge amount of support for 16 other paragraphs that everybody agreed on. The importance of focusing on energy, both traditional, conventional, and renewable. The importance of education to make societies more competitive in the 21st century. The importance of empowering women and small businesses. So, unfortunately, the focus in the press wasn't on those pragmatic solutions, but there was a huge amount of discussion of those in the summit itself.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Rivera for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to raise the specter of the recent visit between President Obama and Mr. Medvedev, Putin's puppet in Russia, in which President Obama expressed flexibility or a willingness to be more flexible with respect to U.S.-Russian relations after the upcoming election. And Mr. Medvedev's response that he will, of course, inform his master, Putin, of the President's willingness for flexibility. Because in essence, what the President was signaling to our allies, like Poland, a great ally, that we are willing to throw them under a bus on an issue like missile defense. and risk our own security as well once the nuisance of an election is behind President Obama. I think that was an extraordinary message to be sending to our allies, and a very dangerous message to be sending to our foes. I know that in Cartagena after the summit, there was a lack of consensus, as you just cited, regarding a statement inviting Cuba to participate in the next summit, and I know some of our diplomats saw that as some sort of a victory, and that thus maybe we should tone down expressing our concerns on this matter, because of course that's what diplomats do. They don't want to make waves. But I believe President Obama's colloquy with Medvedev gives me grave concerns on a host of foreign policy and national security issues. So let me just ask you specifically and directly, did President Obama or any member of this administration communicate to representatives of any government any private assurances of flexibility after this election with respect to Cuba's admission into the summit process?
Congressman, we did not.
Thank you. Let me ask you another question very directly. If President Obama is reelected, and assuming you continue in your post, which I hope you will, and assuming Cuba remains the totalitarian dictatorship that exists today, when that summit comes up again in Panama, will the United States attend the next summit in Panama if Cuba participates?
I have to say, Congressman, there's so many hypotheticals in there.
There's only two.
Well,
President Obama being reelected and Cuba being a totalitarian communist dictatorship that is on the list of terrorist sponsors by your State Department, that your State Department has issued. You have placed Cuba on the list of terrorist sponsors. If those conditions exist at the next summit in Panama, will the United States participate if Cuba participates?
Congressman, I can't say definitively what status Cuba will have 3 years hence. Hang on one
Today's
second.
status.
But if nothing changes, then neither would our position.
So if nothing changes in Cuba with respect to their governing structure, and there is an effort to include Cuba, and indeed that effort succeeds and comes to fruition, the United States will not participate in the Summit of the Americas in Panama. Is that correct?
What I can't do here is make you a promise on behalf of the President. I can't speak for a future action by the President. But what I can tell you is nothing will have changed in our view that Cuba should not be part of the summit process until they are a democracy and have made changes. If those changes have not come, we will not believe they should be part of the summit process. And we will have to confront that at the time that the summit is being planned.
Well, I hope.
It might include lots of different options.
Well, I hope you will. I hope a very clear signal will be sent by whatever administration is in power in the White House after these elections, that under no circumstances will the United States provide credibility, legitimacy, credence to a supposedly democratic process when such an anti-democratic regime like the Castro dictatorship would be participating. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. I'd now like to recognize Mr. Sears for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, let me congratulate the Secretary of State and the President for holding firm on not allowing Cuba in the summit. I know it was not easy. I was very disappointed that the OAS was hiding under a rock and not making any comments about this issue. So that's disappointing. At the same time, I was more disappointed at what happened with our security forces. You know, not only for ruining this summer for the President, but really ruining it for the people of Colombia and what they've done over the last 10 years. They try to put a new face on this hemisphere. They work so hard, And yet the news out of Colombia is about what went on with the security forces. They all should be dismissed. There's no room for that. And I feel very bad for the people of Colombia. They worked very hard. And some of my Colombian friends have talked to me and said to me, you know, for 10 years, all we see on CNN and all these other stations is, you know, the terrorists in Colombia and what's going on in Colombia. And now after this summit, what we see is about prostitutes in Colombia. So it is really a sad commentary on those people that, and I know that not all of them did it, but those 10 or 12 people that were involved, it's really a sad commentary. The other thing is, I want you to talk to me a little bit about this idea that maybe we're shifting money from the Western Hemisphere and put it around the Middle East and Asia. I'm very concerned. I really think that what I took away from the summit and talking to some of those presidents is that they also are concerned. And, you know, they were our closest neighbors. So, and especially what's going on with China trying to get a foothold in all these countries. So can you just speak a little bit to that?
Absolutely. There's two things I want to mention. One is, just before I turn to the assistance, just how much engagement we have with countries where there is no assistance component. You just saw the visit of President Dilma Rousseff to Washington from Brazil. The Secretary went on to Brazil after the summit. We have just multiple dialogues with Brazil. Brazil is shifting in their relationship with us vis-a-vis assistance to become a partner in donating assistance to Africa with us, working together on food security. So some of the closest relationships that we have are no longer defined by assistance because the countries have graduated, have outgrown assistance, and that is a very good thing. But it doesn't mean there is less of a partnership with those countries. In other cases, we have countries where we've had very intense, very large aid relationships, like with Colombia, over about 12 years, and that aid is on a down slope because of Colombia's success and because of their economic ability to assume greater financial responsibility. Again, it does not signify a lessening of our commitment to Colombia. It signifies the gradual and managed transition of an aid relationship to one where Colombia can take on more of that responsibility. In Mexico, the shift is from some large pieces of equipment that are expensive, frankly, that we put in the beginning of the Merida Initiative, despite how long it took to get things there, to one that is much more intense on training and building capacity, which frankly is cheaper than helicopters. So I think it's important to recognize that while some of those numbers are going down slightly, the intensity of the cooperation is just as great, and in some cases it's increasing. I think that's also true in Central America and in the Caribbean, where the capacity is not as great, where we really do have to stay engaged longer. We've tried to maintain those levels of funding and in some cases increase them because we know there isn't as much capacity. So while I know that there's lots of attention on the Middle East, on Asia, on other parts of the world, we think we've done a pretty good job at defending levels of assistance that will enable us to maintain those intense relationships on issues of critical importance to the U.S.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, because one of the concerns that some of the presidents, especially Central Americans, have is that they're going to become the route, or they already have become the route, where the drugs are going to be transported, and they are fearful that they do not have the means to stop it. So I do hope that we keep concentrating in those areas. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. And if the Assistant Secretary doesn't mind, we'd like to have another round of questions, and they just get easier. Yeah, it just gets easier. I want to go back. There's clearly a difference in opinion with the OAS, and I respect that other people will have a different opinion than mine. But what concerns me about the OAS is, you know, we saw what happened in Honduras, and I believe that the OAS, instead of standing up for the people of Honduras and their democracy and constitution, instead sided with Chavez and Zelaya. And in fact, I think that our own administration had the wrong position, and the State Department had the wrong position. That, so I don't know why we continue to, the idea of multilateral, bilateral, if you're part of an organization that ultimately brings down the overall strength of democracy in an attempt to try to be friends with everybody, that's not getting us anywhere. And you keep pointing to the work it does in monitoring elections. I'm not sure that there are some who think they do good work monitoring elections, but there are some, including myself, that don't. So I don't know that. We'll have a longer discussion about this, and maybe we'll have invite you back and have another hearing on the OAS, because I do believe that they stand in the way of democracy building and protecting democracies in Latin America instead of supporting democracies. And there shouldn't be a question. People shouldn't have to guess where the OAS or the United States or any other democracy would stand on these issues. And like Congressman Sierra said, sometimes when they are quiet on issues as it relates to Cuba, it causes a lot of problems here in the United States. But I wanted to turn quickly to Argentina. I believe, and I have for a while now, that Argentina is up to no good and is turning away from freedom, democracy. We see it with the taking of business assets when they play shenanigans with accusing the United States of doing things. And then, we know that there are court documents and court proceedings that they continue to ignore. And so I just would like to get, from your perspective, from the State Department's perspective, where you see Argentina in its relationships to the United States. Do you see it one that is challenged or one that is on solid footing?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that question. And I guess I would say it is a difficult relationship. And it is one in which we are working very hard to try and focus on the things we can move ahead on, focus on the positive. I was in Argentina in February. I studied there as a student. It's a place I have a great fondness for. And we're trying to move ahead in areas that we can and that are positive. But frankly, there are areas of the relationship that are very challenging and which are not moving ahead. And some of those are Argentina's relationship to the international financial community. You made reference, I think, to some of the outstanding claims, the arbitral awards by ICSID, as the acronym is known, which Argentina has not paid. That was the reason that we announced at the end of March recommendation to suspend Argentina's GSP privileges, certain trade privileges. We think that Argentina needs to get itself back into a positive relationship with the international financial community, both for their own economic future and for the system and those creditors in the United States and elsewhere. So that continues to be a very challenging part of the relationship. The security relationship is also not back to normal yet. We would like it to get there, but since the incident with the DoD plane over a year ago, we have not been able to work as much on issues like narcotics trafficking that we would like to. So we are still committed to working with Argentina on lots of issues, counterterrorism, educational issues, et cetera. But there are challenges in that relationship.
Thank you very much. My time has expired. And Congressman Sears, do you have another question? You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Can you talk a little bit about the progress that we have made in Haiti with the money that we have given them in terms of infrastructure and basic services? Because I know a lot of people are concerned that we're putting a lot of money in Haiti and maybe it's not getting to the people. So can you just talk a little bit about that?
Sure, thank you. There's no doubt, I think, in anyone's mind that we would all like to see the assistance that has been appropriated for Haiti and that is being delivered to Haiti implemented it faster and affect people on the ground faster. I think the last year has seen an acceleration of the implementation of those funds. Half of the rubble from the earthquake has now been cleared. That took a very long time, but that's critically important. You've got the number of internally displaced persons going down from about 1.5 million to below 500,000, people moving into housing. Obviously, great efforts being made against cholera to try and control the spread of that in sanitation and health services. But there is still a huge amount to be done. And there's no doubt that we have to continue to, frankly, keep our foot to the pedal here because there's a huge amount to be done. And, frankly, some of that needs to be done with a government of Haiti that has a prime minister in place. And so, as you know, the previous prime minister has resigned. He's in caretaker capacity. A new prime minister has been nominated, passed by their Senate, and we're hopeful that that person will be passed by the lower house, and that then we'll be able to accelerate the efforts still further. But there is a great deal more to be done.
I know that the private sector has helped immensely in Haiti. How is the coordination between the private sector and us in terms of whatever is needed, to work together on?
I think that's obviously a critical part of the reconstruction effort. There are a number of major projects, whether it's port projects, whether it's an industrial park that's scheduled to open fairly soon. The private sector role in all of this and its coordination with the international community and the donors has been critical throughout, and that communication will continue to be very strong.
Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Sears. Mr. Rivera, recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, it has been the policy of this administration since it was inaugurated vis-a-vis U.S.-Cuba relations to loosen travel and trade regulations and sanctions on the Castro dictatorship. The result of that policy, which I often refer to as unilateral concessions to the dictatorship, have been well documented. A wave of repression across the island. Cuba continues to harbor fugitives from U.S. justice, including cop killers and drug traffickers. Cuba continues to be on the State Department list of sponsors of terrorism, even going to the extent of taking and holding a United States citizen, Alan Gross, hostage in Cuba with an expressed willingness, as Bill Richardson's trip to Havana demonstrates, an expressed willingness to try to trade that hostage to the United States. Is there anything else the Castro dictatorship could do that would actually trigger this administration to tighten sanctions?
Well, Congressman, let me start off by saying that the people-to-people programs, the regulatory changes to allow purposeful travel to Cuba are not designed as anything that benefits the regime. They're designed to benefit the Cuban people. They're designed to allow more contact outside of government for Cuban citizens and American citizens in particular areas. And so we don't see those as positive for the government of Cuba, but for the people of Cuba. We have kept all of the embargo provisions in place. As you know, those are by law. Those are not ones that could change in regulation. And there's no plan to change those at this point. We've also engaged with the Cuban government only on issues, frankly, that are in our national interest, that are in our national security interest, when it is critical to our interests to do so. So we believe that we've kept a very firm line on sanctions with the Cuban government, but tried to open up space for average Cubans separate from their government.
Can you cite any progress in democratic reforms on the island that have resulted from that policy?
Congressman, I can't give you specific examples yet of areas in which citizens have yet been able to exercise more freely political rights. I wish I could, but I do believe, and I'm sure that you would agree, that American citizens are often the best ambassadors for our country. And I do think that that increased contact helps bring us closer to the
Well, of
day
course,
when
that contact did not begin with this administration. We've always had travel, family unification, and other types of licensed travel to Cuba, and it hasn't resulted in any democratic reforms. But let me just go, I only have a minute left, to Venezuela very quickly, because my understanding is that in January of this year, you were sent documents from the Venezuelan Ministry of Justice implicating Hugo Chavez in covering up a case involving a 2.2-ton shipment of cocaine in November of 2005, and that according to these materials, President Chavez was notified in writing of, quote, sufficient evidence linking then Brigadier General Henry de Jesus Rangel Silva in the smuggling case, and that rather than ordering an inquiry into this denunciation of Rangel Silva's involvement in narcotics trafficking, Chavez has actually named him his Minister of Defense. And I'm wondering what action, if any, was taken to expose this apparent criminality.
Congressman, all I can say on that is that when we receive information about potential wrongdoing, allegations of wrongdoing in Venezuela, as in every other country, we make sure that we pass those documents to the relevant U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies and continue to look at those very carefully for potential future actions.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Rivera. And I think, if you don't mind, I know I've got one more round of questions, and if you don't mind, and we'll make this the last one. One of the other issues that came out of or that was talked quite a bit during our meetings at the summit was this notion of legalizing drugs. And I wanted to first give you a minute, if you would like, to here on the record here in the committee state the official position of the administration and the State Department and our U.S. government.
Sure. Very quickly, I can tell you that that is not a direction the United States government believes we should go, that legalization is not the answer to this problem. But we understand the frustration of countries with the violence and the difficulty in confronting trafficking, and we've got to discuss a whole lot of options to confront it, but we don't believe legalization is the way to go.
Thank you. I think it's important, you know, obviously this is an area where we agree very much, and was concerned that there was so much talk about it in Latin America at the summit on this idea that you know, dialogue is good. Well, dialogue is good, but there are certain things you don't put on the table, and we think that legalizing drugs is one of those issues that just should not be on the table. We know in the United States we have an epidemic on prescription drug abuse, and that is legal. Those are legal drugs, but it's the #1 killer over cocaine and heroin combined. So we think that I just wanted to give you an opportunity here on the record. So I think that's an area that we agree. The last question that I have is I want to talk about Mexico a little bit, and you know, the drug cartels in Mexico have certainly evolved over time, and there is no doubt that they are you know, they cross. They're operating in countries other than just Mexico. We know that they are operating here in the United States. We know that they have operating in Central and South America, and you know, and the Merida Initiative, although I think we all think it is good, I'm not sure that it is a program that is situated to handle the evolution in Mexico. And I know it's a touchy subject. Every time I bring up counterinsurgency, we get our friends that aren't happy with me. But I believe that if we're going to be successful in confronting these insurgencies in Mexico, then it's going to take an all-of-government approach. I'm concerned that the Merida Initiative lacks some of the ability to do that, and I'd like to just get your opinion on those issues.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think you know that I've worked on Mexico for quite a long time, and I completely agree that a whole-of-government approach is absolutely what's needed. What I think is important to remember is that the Merida Initiative and the foreign assistance that the State Department administers, which we work with our colleagues in USAID, within the State Department in our International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Office, but also with our colleagues in DEA, in FBI, in DHS, both ICE and others, is only part of what we work with Mexico on. There are also programs under DOD and for the U.S. military to work jointly with counterparts in Mexico on training. So we feel like we really have crossed the law enforcement and security force spectrum to include all the best ideas to respond to the threat and to work with counterparts.
Thank you. I appreciate that, but I guess I see it a little differently. And we're back to this kind of silo mentality. And what I'm talking about is how do we approach this where we're when we do an all-of-government approach, that all of government is actually working together in a coordinated effort. And absolutely, I know that there are many agencies, departments in the U.S. government that is participating in Mexico. But I'm concerned about the coordination, and that I know that there's been advances, but I think if we have a program that's going to look at it as one, if you will, so that instead of having the silo mentalities of how we're going to deal with the insurgents in Mexico, because look, frankly, the people who live along the southern border are fearful, and so you've got drugs and criminals and terrorist organizations that are trying to move north across the border, and you've got guns and money that's moving south. So it's a shared interest to secure that border, and also to ensure that the insurgents in Mexico don't have the ability to continue to operate in the United States and in Central and South America. So I think this whole-of-government approach needs to be done under one spectrum instead of a silo and the silo effect that we have now. I'll just leave that with you, and thank you very much. Next is Mr. Sears for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, we have a situation in Venezuela where the president is obviously in Cuba for treatment, and elections are in October. One way maybe that the OAS can become useful is by sending monitors to the election process and be observers. I was just wondering if anything like that has been discussed or anything with the OAS, and do you know what kind of plans are we making in case Chavez doesn't leave Cuba?
Congressman, we certainly believe that international and domestic election observers will be very important in Venezuela, and we would strongly support election observation missions for the October elections. There's obviously lots of different organizations that may be able to do that. Within the OAS context, the Venezuelan government would have to request the OAS monitor the elections. We hope they will do that. And we certainly are talking with partners and folks around the hemisphere to encourage election monitoring. But we think it's equally important that domestic organizations be able to monitor the elections within Venezuela. And in terms of the issues of President Chavez's health, we really don't have any more information than everybody else has, but we're obviously watching things very closely, making sure we have good information, reaching out to Venezuelans of all stripes, as we have over the last number of years, and will continue to do regardless of his health status.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sears. Now I recognize Mr. Rivera for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you very much. I'm pleasantly surprised that we get another round. I didn't know we would, but so maybe I'll ask about Cuba. And something very interesting happened in the summit. And, again, just want you to kind of have a free association moment here. But Congressman Cedars and Congressman Mack and Congressman Engel and I, we were in some meetings where I remember some of us asked presidents of Latin American countries, why is it that there's this push to integrate Cuba into the summit process so vehemently among some presidents? And we actually had presidents tell us, in a moment of candor, that the main reason is because many Latin American countries fear upheaval and civil unrest among the more leftist sectors of their society, labor groups, student groups, non-government organizations that are very sympathetic and have alignment and nexus with the Castro dictatorship. And so in order to prevent those types of disturbances and civil unrest, they kowtow to the Castro brothers. We actually heard that from Latin American presidents. President Calderon from Mexico was here yesterday. We met with him, and I asked him what he could cite as the success of over 50 years of engagement by Latin America in Cuba, what democratic reforms they can cite, because they always call our policy a failure. So I asked him for the successes in terms of democratic reforms of engagement in Cuba by Mexico and other Latin American countries. And his response was, well, we were able to extract Mexican citizens from Cuba's prisons. And again, he stated how Cuba had these relationships with terrorist organizations like the FARC, but they never had terrorist problems in Mexico precisely because of their friendly relationship with the Castro brothers. And so you have so much experience in Latin America, and I'm just going to ask you to, whatever candor you can give here within the parameters of being a diplomat and a representative of the U.S. government, does any of this ring true to you?
I guess the part that rings true is that all politicians have different constituencies to engage with. But I also think the president said it really well when he talked about moving beyond left and right. And there are universal standards that we in this hemisphere have signed up to. And I think some of those old debates about, the left and the right domestically in countries throughout the hemisphere are just not as relevant as they used to be.
So you don't believe that Latin American leaders fear the connections between the Castro brothers and leftist elements, whether it be terrorist elements or civil elements in their societies, and therefore that's why they seem to be so compliant towards the Castro dictatorship?
I think it's very hard for me to assert what they may feel or have.
I'm asking just based on your experience as a diplomat throughout Latin America.
That. I really do. I appreciate that, and I appreciate your confidence that I can ascertain sort of the reasons behind this. But I certainly think, as I said, I guess in the start, they all have constituencies. So there may be some element of political evaluation that this is an issue on which the left cares deeply, and they may want to address that particular constituency.
Well, I appreciate that. I've got 1 minute left, and I'd like to ask you with respect to Millennium Challenge funds and Central America, particularly in El Salvador. We've seen what's been happening with El Salvador and confiscation of U.S. investments in El Salvador and so forth, and in other countries in Central America. Do you think it's time for perhaps the United States to reassess our relationship in terms of these programs with these countries that are having, I guess, offensive behavior, really, towards U.S. interests in these countries?
Congressman, I think it's very important that we pursue issues of potential expropriation or takings of properties with governments, whether it's El Salvador or others in the hemisphere, and we're going to do that pretty aggressively. But I don't think we have come to the conclusion that it would necessarily be productive to end relationships through the MCC or other of our assistance programs, which go to some of the poorest in those countries, and we continue to believe are very important programs. That doesn't mean we're not going to work on the issues of potential takings or expropriations.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Rivera. And for the last question, Congressman Engel is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've all mentioned Cuba, and I mentioned Alan Gross. I'm wondering if you could just update us. Is there anything new about him? It's just really an outrage that the Castro government continues to hold him on trumped-up charges, and it's just a disgrace. Anything new with that?
Mr. Engel, I really wish I could bring you some new news there. I truly do. This is an issue that I've been working very hard personally, but more importantly, so have my boss, Undersecretary Sherman, and the Secretary and others. And we've used just about every means that we could to try and get Alan Gross home where he belongs with his family. We had some hope that the Cuban government would take the opportunity of the Pope's visit to make this gesture and to release Alan Gross. His mother's 90th birthday was just about 10 days ago while we were in Cartagena. She's very ill with lung cancer. There is just no reason to hold this man and not to allow him to be home with his family. And we'll continue to use every mechanism that we can. But I have no progress on that front to report to you.
You know, thank you. We've all made the point that Cuba has not moved at all towards democracy and why it should not participate in another conference if it hasn't changed. Democracy aside, and that's the most important issue, but something as small as this, Cuba, the government of Cuba has shown its total intransigence on every matter, not just democracy, not just allowing political pluralism, not just human rights. This is an American citizen who does not, by any stretch of the imagination, deserve to be incarcerated, and they won't even budge on that. So it's very disheartening that people want to still give them a free pass and say that we should just keep a blind eye and just pretend that it doesn't matter what kind of government any country has. You know, we're all the same, and I think that undermines the organizations and the countries that talk that way. It really diminishes them. Could you talk to me about the SIFTA treaty, the gun trafficking SIFTA treaty? The State Department's confirmed that the U.S. is in compliance with SIFTA. And is this true? And what's the status of the treaty and efforts to get it ratified in the Senate?
Thank you, Congressman. We, as you know, have sent the treaty, the SIFTA treaty, the Small Arms Treaty, to the Senate after it was signed in 1997. What's changed since then, I'm happy to say, is that the treaty is on the State Department's or the administration's list of priority treaties, and that's as of last October when that went forward to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. So we're still hoping that there will be movement on that treaty. Most importantly, I think it's important to make clear that there are no U.S. laws or regulations that would have to change for implementation of the SIFTA treaty. It recognizes legal rights to own guns and weapons, and we do not believe there is a conflict between the SIFTA treaty and the laws and the rights that American citizens enjoy. So we hope that it will move ahead. We think it's important in the hemisphere.
Let me thank you. Let me ask you a question about Colombia. I mentioned before that I supported the FTA with Colombia, and I believe that Colombia is a tremendous example of a country that works with us, is a strong ally, and I can't say anything more. I'm very pleased with the fact that they have done everything we expected of them. But can you tell me if Colombia has fully implemented the Labor Action Plan? Because there has been some talk that they have not, and if that's not true, which sections still require implementation, and is there a firm timetable for implementation?
Congressman, I think that Ron Kirk, the U.S. Trade Representative, said it pretty well in Cartagena when he talked about the Colombian government reaching all of the milestones that we expected and hoped for in the Labor Action Plan. They are clearly making serious efforts to protect trade unionists, to ensure that there are prosecutions of cases of violence against union leaders, and that we were pleased enough with that progress, obviously, for the free trade agreement to be put into effect. But I will tell you that there still are things that need to be done, and we'll continue to work with the Colombian government, really without an end date, but continue to work with them to implement fully those provisions and to continue to improve the record on trade unions.
Thank you. Can you talk, I don't know if when I was out of the room, if we talked a lot about Mexico. What is the status of Merida? Are the funds still flowing? We still know there's lots of help that the Mexicans need, and I think that in terms of our relationships with countries, all the countries to our south, none is more important than our relationship with Mexico. Obviously, we share a large border. They've been a good ally, and what happens down there affects us up here and vice versa.
Congressman, we're very happy that the pace of implementation has accelerated pretty dramatically in Mexico. The Secretary committed that last calendar year we would implement $500 million in assistance, and we hit that goal, made it just over that, so that we're over $900 million implemented already in the Merida Initiative, but we're continuing. That number continues to increase, and to continue to work with the Mexicans. And now the shift is also to work with Mexican states, because Mexican police are over 400,000 in state and local jurisdictions and only 40,000 at the federal level. So there's clearly a lot more we still have to do, but there's huge progress that's been made.
Okay, I see my time is up, so I want to thank you again, and thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Engel, and thank you very much for your time, for your responsiveness to our questions. We appreciate it so much, and we look forward to the next time we can have you back in front of the committee and continue the dialogue. So thank you very much. The committee hearing is now adjourned.